Melbourne. It was the summer, so it must have been the summer of 2019. It feels like a decade ago. And a mutual acquaintance, mutual friend, Jane Davidson, said to me, "Oh, you must meet Helen English." And I said, "I used to know someone called Helen English when I was a student at the Guildhall, when I was a singer, and she was a pianist." And Jane said, "Yup, that's the one." And so it was lovely. I don't know how many decades it was since Helen and I had met, but we got on just as well as we had done in those days. And to my great delight and joy, I discovered she had become senior lecturer and director of the School and Community Engagement for the School of Creative Arts at the University of Newcastle. And that is Newcastle in New South Wales, which you can see behind her. Now, she's talking today about her PhD research on colonial music making in the 19th century. And that is a real interest to those of us here who have heard Jeff Thomason talking about his research, or Anna talking about her research, or Rachel Johnson, who just got her PhD with a hats off, no amendments, on for her research on music making in Manchester at around the same time in the second half of the 19th century. So that's a really interesting comparison for us. And that was one of the reasons that I wanted Helen to come and speak. And the other thing about Helen, actually, she looks like an early career researcher, but in fact, her PhD was awarded less than 5 years ago. So doing really, really well. Lots of books to her name. I do recommend looking at her webpage on the Newcastle website. Now, the other reason that I wanted Helen to come was that I was very much hoping that Jenny Henley would be here, because there are lots of overlaps between Helen's work and Jenny's work. Because like Jenny, Helen is absolutely passionate about equality of access to music. And so specifically, Helen is involved in outreach to schools in communities with low socioeconomic status. And she's working with colleagues at Newcastle and Melbourne, including Jane Davidson, in a creative aging research program. And so in this coming year, she's planning a large-scale songwriting and performance research study based on some projects she's been doing over the last year or so with 3 aged care homes and Lake Macquarie Council. And I'm very glad you told me it's Macquarie, because I never know how to pronounce it, Helen. And now I know it's Macquarie and not Macquarie. So Macquarie, everybody. So thank you very much indeed. If we were all here, I can't reach my reactions button, but we would all give you a round of applause to start. So welcome, Helen.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. So I'd like to begin by thanking you so much for inviting me, and I can sense that you're a very lovely, welcoming group, which is very good when it's 3 a.m. And I'd also like to do what we always do here, which is acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, which is for me the Awabakal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and particularly, of course, Indigenous music makers. So thanks so much again for inviting me. Just one thing that I might just boast about is I recently got promoted, so hooray, now I'm an associate professor, which was a very nice start to the year. So what I'm talking about today is, yes, my PhD research, which is now published as a book, which is just in the corner there. Can everyone see the presentation okay? Yep, great. So that book has got obviously more detail. Okay, I've decided that it's a lot more engaging if I don't read anything from notes. So I'll do my best. And if I miss something out, you have to go to the questions, make a note of them, or put them in the chat if you have one. So I think to start with, because some of you are perhaps PhD researchers, I'm not sure, but I thought I'd start off by saying, why did I get drawn into researching music in colonial Newcastle, where I found myself living after a stint in Tasmania. And actually the initial impetus came from some research into, well, the invitation to join artists in an exhibition that reflected on Mark Twain's visit to Newcastle in 1895, which sounds very exciting, but he was only here for 6 hours. But it was a great catalyst for reflection on Mark Twain and the coming together of those cultures. And so I thought, well, probably a soundscape would be suitable for an art exhibition. So I started looking into what music was going on in Newcastle. So when I say Newcastle, I mean the city of Newcastle, but in the 19th century, it was really dispersed and a sort of multi-center coal mining area. And it sits within the Hunter Valley, which has a lot of winemaking, so you may have heard of it. And nearby is another town, Maitland, which was more of a pastoral town and a little bit more gentrified than Newcastle. So looking at the newspapers, I was amazed at how much was going on in Newcastle in 1895. So I started to get interested. So then I thought that maybe I would have a topic for further research. And from 2012, I was publishing articles about music in the region. And so some things to note about the region. It's obviously a coal mining region. I think it's the biggest coal mining region in the Southern Hemisphere. I might be wrong, I think. And we export coal to China. But currently China's not taking much of our produce. So that's interesting. Personally, I don't approve of coal mining, so don't get the wrong idea. And the people who came out to mine the coal, initially it was convicts, but they had absolutely no technology and they were just basically trying to dig it out with spades. But once they got going in a more systematic way, there was a need for people who were skilled in coal mining. And so migrants were encouraged to come out from the coal mining areas of Britain. So therefore, it's a very strongly British area of the colonies. It still is today, very, very proudly working class as well. And at the time they came out, really they were coming into and having to start mines in the bush with virtually no infrastructure. In 1874, there was a huge celebration because a road was going to be built. So that gives you an idea of how poor it was. And so this also, though, had the effect of encouraging their own resourcefulness, and they're looking for making their own amusements, but also their own structures and building communities. And then, of course, as you would know about coal mining, it's very difficult and dangerous. It was also very irregular. So you usually didn't know if there was any work from day to day. So it's a little bit about the region. So I mentioned that I was researching music in Newcastle, and I was quite interested in a broad way to start with, but I got really interested in the coal miners and their music. Because I suppose the 19th century image of the coal miner is of this uncultured, illiterate person, dehumanized through language that's borrowed from colonized peoples, so often described as a savage or a person with their own customs and way of life. And that, which you may be familiar with in Britain, carried over to the colonies, that attitude. So I don't know if you've had this experience, but during my research, I sometimes had little finds, which weren't just little, they were actually really significant, where you find something, a letter. Actually, in my case, most of my research was done in local and national newspapers, but I found a letter, one of their significant letters or articles I found was written in 1863 and it was signed a working miner. And it was all about how, wouldn't it be great if we had a harmonic society and clubs and a philharmonic, people here who play musical instruments, we should get together. Very aspirational and really surprising, because Wallsend Mine had only been operating for a couple of years and they were sort of living in bush in bark huts. But this miner had this aspirational vision, and it actually came true. So in spite of someone writing back saying what a ridiculous dreams you're having, there actually was a harmonic society within a few years, and brass bands were formed and so on. So this little comment here is about how, I don't know how familiar you are with colonial history, but for sure, people coming out came to a strange land. The class system was not really established in the same way. And in fact, it was kind of a bit initially very strange, because it was mostly people from the military and convicts. So there was an odd society with there was no middle class that started to emerge in the 1850s. And so a lot of work's been done on how people tried to familiarize the environment through things like gardening, fencing, recreating things from home, even importing, of course, songbirds and plants. And so that becomes part of my argument, that people familiarized their environment through music. Okay, so why did I think it was worth looking into this topic of settler miners and their music? Well, because the volume and frequency of music activities, in spite of the fact, obviously, that they were working, but I was struck by how many events were reported on in the newspapers, which incidentally ranged from the usual sort of rather superior reporting about things like musical taste to the Miners' Advocate, which must have been named for the same one in Northumberland, and which was written by miners for miners, and is a lot more down to earth and has a lot more detail. So it's great. So bands and choirs, yes, these were established early on. The choirs often associated with churches. Primitive Methodism was really big, and this is the biggest area for primitive Methodism in the 19th century in Australia. And bands emerged from sort of mixed bands for the temperance movement to brass bands associated with townships. Important point of difference to Britain is that the brass bands were sustained by the communities and not by the collieries. Another thing that was really exciting was that the complete concert programs were often to be found in the newspapers, and this allowed for research into what kind of music they were playing, obviously, what instruments they had to hand, and how they actually put together a program in an interesting way. And music was noted at almost every community and civic event. So that really was the thing that drew me to it. So I was really interested, and I still am interested, obviously, it's not in the past, in what music does for people. So how did the music help these settlers to form communities? What was it doing for them? And actually in my PhD, I had a sociology supervisor who was actually, she's now at Sydney, but she had come out from the UK. And with her guidance, I moved into looking at sociological approaches to understanding how music was used. And I was really taken with Tia Denora's use of affordance from James Gibson's work on how we interact with music. So what music affords us, and that's based on an idea of an organism and in an environment. And the environment, or the niche, as he calls it, or the ecology of the organism, has various things which afford possibilities for that organism in relation to what that organism is physically and intellectually, if you like, in terms of its size and what it needs. So those things that originally were sort of developed around objects, and affordance, of course, is used hugely by designers, can also be applied to culture. And because it was the 19th century, it seemed important to also include the work of Pierre Bourdieu, because a lot of it was about status, perhaps not in exactly the same way as in Europe, but certainly for the miners, it was about respect. And the music had, the colonies obviously followed what was happening in their colonizing country, which was Britain, or England specifically. So anything that was important there was important in the colonies, but we'll come to that in a minute. And then I also drew on Benedict Anderson's idea of imagined communities, which was promoted through the newspapers as the main source of information in the 19th century. So imagined communities mean communities of readership who can feel that they're part of this readership community. Actually, it's quite relevant to COVID, I guess. I only just thought of that. But so not only would you feel like you were a member of this colonial community, but you also can feel connected back to the community from home, a place that you probably were never going to go back to. And then for various reasons, partly because, of course, it wasn't terra nullius. They came to a land that was already being cared for by Indigenous people, so Aboriginal people in this instance. And these people were obviously driven off the land and decimated. So it's important to keep that always in mind, even if you are researching an area like this, even if there isn't any obvious mention of Aboriginal people, find a way to, or any native peoples, Indigenous peoples, find a way to discuss it all the same, because otherwise you just there's another cone of silence around it. But also racism was part of the colonial weaponry, if you like. So, and I recommend Mac Deasy's book. It's fantastic, about England making itself the center of the empire. So you find racist language in London, for example, about street Arabs, or places, sort of areas of housing described as swamps, things like that. So all sort of dehumanizing language. And so Ali Ratanzi is also writes about racism, and Anne McClintock did amazing work about particularly about Pears soap and the empire. You should check it out, it's brilliant. And then I was wondering, how does sound work in the environment? How did that help people or not? So I looked at sound theory as well, because I'd done some soundscape work that was quite relevant for me. And of course, in the 19th century, things like respectability, incredibly important as to whether you were deemed respectable or not. And in the colonies, Lynette Finch wrote some early work about how people were categorized as respectable or unrespectable, and what the consequences of being unrespectable were. And then Penny Russell has written quite a lot about gentility, in particular how women are the performers of gentility in a place where the class system was not established. Okay, so that's the theoretical framework. So from Denora, I took her sort of main themes, which are music and the self, which you could break down into music and emotions, music and memory, and self-identity. And I took a second theme would be music and the body, how music energizes us, how it regulates us in the sense of keeping us safe. So it affects obviously our respiratory and cardio systems. So and that's something that's understood in, for example, work with neonatal infants, that they can latch on to music and it helps them to self-regulate. And then it can also extend the body's capabilities. And music and the social is about building social cohesion through musical endeavors, social spaces, and social capital. So also, of course, worlds, so musical worlds, which are inhabited by music, but also by people who have something to listen to, but also to talk about. So very important, creating those musical spheres or worlds. And music and status, which was, I expect that a lot of you are familiar with Bourdieu's work and the assignment of capital to the kind of art that you listened to, talked about, bought, etc., consumed. But in the case of miners, this cultural capital was part of the reason why they were able to gain respect. And music and identity, so music associated with different groups. In the case of miners, that might be as miners, as working class, as coming from specific regions of Britain. And just before I finish the thing about Britain, and in a lot of research, up to I don't know, recently, migrants were sort of categorized as being British or something else, and there wasn't much teasing apart of the different countries that make up Britain. And I keep saying Britain because it's more of a 19th century term than the UK, obviously. So at this time, people came out from South Wales, where they spoke Welsh, obviously, and that some of them didn't speak English at all. And they came from Northumberland and Durham, so speaking with a very heavy Geordie dialect. And they came from southeastern Scotland, so speaking Scots, which I believe is probably related to Geordie. And also some came from Ireland, although it wasn't a very popular destination for the Irish compared to the rest of Australia. So there actually were different nations or countries represented who were being thrown in together. Okay, so I wasn't sure if you were into this sort of 19th century research when I wrote this, so apologies if this is all terribly familiar, but obviously music was hugely important in Europe in the 19th century, and the rising middle class, it was a means to improve their status and cultural capital by aligning with music of the right kind. And of course, William Webber is a very important author in this field, and that really builds on Bourdieu's work, although he doesn't really mention Bourdieu. I think he might in one of his later books. So the other side of that, and the emergence, as you would know, in the 19th century of concerts that are sort of themed around instruments or composers, rather than being a miscellany or a miscellaneous kind of variety concert, was part of that, and also contributed to the separation into popular and art music. And the other side of that, of course, was the rational recreation, which must be very important in Manchester, I imagine, and of course is written about by Dave Russell. And that's, I'm sure you all know, but music was probably one of the most useful rational recreations, if you could have a useful rational recreation. So that's been viewed in different ways. It's sort of a little bit out of date now. It was viewed as a way to control people, an imposition. But in fact, as I'm sure you know, that was kind of turned on itself when working class people took on the brass band, for example, and made it their own thing, and also made it part of their identity, the sound, so that it became something positive rather than a means of control and oppression. So how did this map it onto the colonies? Well, it was hugely important for the colonies to feel connected to England, and to show that they were doing well, and that they were civilized and cultured. So things like music were often written about in the way we see in the first quote from the Australasian Chronicle, an relatively early newspaper, how important it was, not just to compose music, but to perform music. That was written about specifically, probably because there weren't a lot of performances in 1839, so they wanted to make the most of the ones they had. And I didn't mention actually that, of course, the first colonies were Sydney, Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, and Newcastle. So Newcastle was actually one of the earliest colonies in 1802. It was a penal colony, and it became a penal colony for double offenders, so people who offended and were sent to Australia and then re-offended in Australia. So the next quote we see is, I just found this as a lecture, because this in the 19th century was all about improving yourself as well. And so lecture series, the mechanics institutes were important places with libraries for people to educate themselves. And so this is one about the power of music. And I guess, and that's from Maitland, so that's that slightly more gentrified town, which is a city now. But it just shows us how people thought about music at the time. And finally, the one about the rational recreation from the Newcastle Chronicle, about how refining and elevating learning brass instruments is, which people may not quite agree with, but they were probably beginners and they're probably quite young, but it was keeping them out of trouble, and it was also providing some diversion from what was a pretty monotonous existence, as it says. Okay, so I think I've covered most of the things that I should have done by now. I hope I didn't forget anything. So I've said why I chose to do it, and how important some of those quotes were. The working miner in 1863 really made it come into focus, because I saw how important the music was. Then there were a couple more very important ones, but one of them was about changing the attitudes of Sydney, the Sydney power brokers, who became the equivalent of, I suppose, English in attitudes towards Welsh or Geordie coal miners. So Sydney was always trying to put down Newcastle and say that it was uncultured, and they were all excuses to not put any money into infrastructure, really, when it comes to it. So now I'm going to share with you a couple of case studies, which hopefully will show how people use music in a particular way, and allow me to make some comparisons with those Denora ideas about music and its affordances. So the first one is about Welsh music making in the region, and the second one is about a brass band demonstration. So since you're from the north of England, you know that a demonstration isn't necessarily what we think of as a demonstration, but is more of a sort of, it is a demonstration, but not a protest necessarily. In this case, it's a demonstration and not a protest, but more of a celebration, but definitely a demonstration of power. So I'll start with the Welsh music making then. So I don't know if any of you are studying Welsh music, in which case it'd be great to hear your comments. And yes, someone is. Maybe you even speak Welsh, I don't know. So again, apologies if this is all stuff that you've looked at many times, but I guess again, you've got a great interest in 19th century music in Manchester, so you would know that music was part of the sort of arsenal of creation of nations, following Johann Herder's advice to look at folk, what was of the people in creating nation. There was, from the 18th century, there was a keen interest in folk music, and also in anything that spoke of antiquity and nations, because the idea of a nation was relatively new, of course, were keen to look into their past and see what they could show in the way of a culture that continued and could be used to make them distinct from another culture. And of course, that all exploded in Ossian, the imaginary poet in the 19th century, which was a pretty fun example. And if you are interested in this sort of thing, Eric Hobsbawm's work is pretty amazing on tradition, the new traditions of the 19th century. So the Welsh did, of course, have some antiquity, music of antiquity, if you like, in the form of they had a tradition of druids and bards, and they also had something called Penillion singing, and they had harpists, and in the 18th century these harpists became better known outside of Wales, and this sort of sowed a seed of Wales being known for music. But a key but of course, because of coal mining, people were, oh, sorry, that was my, I'm just going to turn off my, I just turned off my emails so it doesn't keep going ding. Yeah, so coal miners all moved, well, sorry, the Welsh moved from rural areas to the coal mines, and so they're quite mixed up within Wales itself, and a lot of rural Welsh only spoke Welsh, of course. So there was this investigation by the English in 1847, well, that was reported in 1847 in what came to be known as the treachery of the Blue Books, in which they condemned the Welsh using language, again, just in that dehumanizing way that they also spoke about Geordie miners, that they were immoral, that their party was superstitious, they had no culture, they were primitive, and they had barbaric on immoral marriage customs, and of course the whole thing of illegitimate children. That was a common way of identifying people who were not respectable in the colonies as well. And this, these publications, in which, in addition, they blamed the immorality of the Welsh on the fact that they were illiterate, by which they meant they didn't speak English; they spoke Welsh, which just goes to show how that attitude, how blinkered they were in their view of the world, and believing themselves to be superior in every way. So this publication had a really traumatic effect on the Welsh and carried on being talked about for a long time, but it did galvanize them into action. And so they sort of got together to think, how can they fight this? And it meant that different factions in Wales actually came together. So the nonconformists worked with the Liberals. There were 4 newspapers that they were able to use to advertise what they were doing. So they focused on education, but they also focused on cultural activities, in particular music. And as a result of that, the Eisteddfod was revived, and the choirs began to be formed. There were sort of public choirs that anyone could join, and Welsh singing became a thing that was known outside of Wales. So the Eisteddfod was attractive because it had these a sense of the ancient, but of course it was a reinvention of the Eisteddfod of ancient times. Okay, so the Welsh who came out to Newcastle came mainly from South Wales, and they joined these communities in places like Wallsend and Lambton, which were 2 mining communities that were quite distant from the city of Newcastle. with, like as I mentioned before, really no transport, because although there were trains, they were for coal only and had to be, special requests had to be made to use them. And in fact, there was quite a petition going on for years to have access to the trains. So they mainly would have walked, and people who could afford it could ride. So this was very striking, because this little article, which there's this extract from, was published in the Empire, which was a Sydney newspaper, actually started by Sir Henry Parkes, who became Sir, who was the Premier of New South Wales Colony later. And this tells us about an Eisteddfod that's going to be held. So that's on the one on the left of the screen, which was held in 1861, and which included a choir, which is interesting because Eisteddfods in Wales, I'm pretty sure, didn't start including choirs until the 1860s, but I might get corrected by someone, so that would be good. And it's really, I just find it really moving the way that it's described in these kind of Welsh terms of this calm evening, and the whole valley was ringing with the soul-inspiring strains. Beautiful. So again, people were enjoying listening to the rehearsals as much as the actual event. And that's quite common. In fact, later in the 1870s, there's an account of a rehearsal where the windows are filled up with faces of people trying to watch the rehearsals through the window. So as you can see with this Eisteddfod, it's all in Welsh. So that's important to note, apart from the word Newcastle. And as is traditional, it's, or 19th century traditional anyway, is divided up into different themes, such as a section for recitation, oration, music, and poetry. And I think there might be one page missing there, I'm not sure. No, I think that's the complete thing. So this was an important cultural event for the Welsh. Incidentally, the prizes were paid for by the Welsh themselves, even though they were all coal miners and probably had very little money. The one on the right is just an example of another Eisteddfod that wasn't long after that, but where it's instead a very short one with only 9 items, and where it's actually advertised in English. So that tells us that it's for a larger audience, and that it's perhaps just a small scale event that could be popular, because the bigger Eisteddfods took months and months of planning. So they were took a lot of community effort and time. Okay, so here are some comments. And also an important thing, which was the colonizing of the Welsh Eisteddfod by the English. So obviously this just points to the fact that the Eisteddfod was something that the English just didn't have, so they wanted to grab it for themselves. And as you can see here, they're going to have a much better one than the Welsh did, of course. And so they put on an English Eisteddfod in 1870 on Anniversary Day, which is now Australia Day. But interestingly, it was in 3 parts, but it did not follow the Welsh way of organising an Eisteddfod, and mixed up things so that it actually came out more like a miscellany or variety type of concert. And each section had an overture, which was played by a recent migrant pianist from Germany. So the structure was quite different, and maybe the purpose was a bit different. So the Welsh Eisteddfod purpose, of course, primarily was about cultural togetherness and connections to Wales that they'd left behind, but it was also to promote music making and music composition, and mostly the Eisteddfods were restricted to working miners, or working people anyway, to take part. So the comment below is from James Churchill Fisher, who came out from Britain to Australia, and he was a tonic solfa devotee. and he convinced the education board to change from solfa to tonic solfa, so from Hulah's to Kerwin's method. And the local community was very strategic with the English of Stedford, which, when I say local community, there were people from various different townships who were involved in it. And they were very strategic because they got Sir Henry Parkes to be the president of the festival. And he, remember, he started the newspaper The Empire. He was the education minister. He believed in education for all, and later became premier. And then they asked James Churchill Fisher, recently appointed to the education board as consultant in music, to adjudicate. So that meant that there was awareness in Sydney, which was incredibly important for Newcastle to get any kind of infrastructure or support. So, and as you can see here, James Fisher wrote it up, an account of it in April 1870, saying that, praising these hardworking miners in their singing, which was great. And he also commented on quite a few individual performers, but he also couldn't help being superior as well. So he wrote about the ludicrous effect of singing a cappella works that were meant to be accompanied. And that really returns to Bourdieu's idea of people having the keys to understand things and the access to education. So they didn't know that you didn't sing things a cappella. They thought that made it fairer to everybody. So that was why they did it. But there's, of course, we've moved so far from this kind of thinking where, you know you're right and everybody else is wrong because they just didn't know about it too bad. But that was the thinking then. So there was no imagination for what these people were dealing with. Okay, so the final bit of the Welsh thing is that there were a few events that leapt out of the newspaper pages, and for the fact that they were either written up in several different newspapers, and including colonial as well as local, or because of the amount of effort that went into them. So this one here is a concert for Caradog, or Griffith. Now I've forgotten if it's Griffith Jones, but yes, Griffith Jones, who was the person that worked with a huge choir from South Wales, took them to Crystal Palace and won the cup at their festival there, and then the following year returned to claim it again. Now, the first year there was no competing choir. The second year there was, and the difference between the two choirs, I think it was a tonic solfa choir, was very noticeable. So this was a starting point for me to wonder, why would you put on a concert which involved a lot of performers, not just from Lambton, which had a large Welsh community, but also from Wallsend and Newcastle, not necessarily all Welsh either. And multiple groups, including Lambton Brass Band, Lambton String Band, and choirs. So why would you go to all this effort? Because Caradog has been successful at Crystal Palace. Well, this really told me how keenly they were following what happened back home, how important music was to their self-respect and their respect in the eyes of others, so the event itself was incredibly important for these local Welsh people. And even though Caradog would never have heard of them, they raised £20 and sent it to him. Now, part of the reason why this also was important was simply that the practical one, that newspapers were reporting regularly in the colonies on the national Eisteddfod once you got started. So that was covered in detail every year. And obviously they also covered, well, they didn't cover it, they borrowed an article on the win at Crystal Palace and published it in Sydney newspapers. So it was something that was being talked about through this community of readership in newspapers. And a few years later, well, in fact, the following year, sorry, from 1874, Mrs. Parker came out from Wales, and she had been in that choir, so that was a huge thing for the local community. They were so excited. And so she would sing at every concert, and she was also dressed in, often performed in Welsh costume, which again was another recently developed tradition. Okay, so now I've been talking a lot, so I better move along. So the next one, I'll try and not be too long with this, was about brass bands. I've already mentioned that they were paid for and supported by communities rather than collieries, with one exception. And thinking about the time where there wasn't much to do, if they were practicing or would come and play in the streets, this had a great effect on people's mood. And there's a lot of the use of the word enspiriting, raising people's spirits in newspaper accounts. In the two photographs, we can see at the top a much later band called the Railway Band, which was mixed instrumentation, 1895. And below is the earliest photograph of a brass band from a township, which is not that early. They just weren't photographed much. So that's the Waratah Brass Band that still exists today. Okay, so I'm talking about the miners' demonstration now. So the miners' demonstration in 1874 was another event that leapt out of the newspapers. They were writing about building up to it for weeks, and then it was reported in multiple newspapers, local and Sydney. And this was to celebrate a landmark agreement with masters about pay, but also about an arbitration board for disputes. So Newcastle is known for its brass bands. In the 1820s, we had an award-winning steelworks band, but it's also known for its unions. And the Miners' Union was formed very early, I think in 1860, and was very active, advocating, but also supporting, of course, miners. And so the planning in advance of this demonstration included engaging brass bands for each contingent of men. And so it was very much a male event. All the brass bands were male, all the miners were male, the masters were male. The families came to watch, so it was kind of a masculine display. But later on, there was dancing and fun for everybody when the proceedings were over. So these miners came by different forms of transport to Newcastle, and mostly by train, and the trains were specially negotiated for. And they all met at Newcastle station, and then they set off on this march, which took 11 minutes to pass any one spot. And just imagine you hear the first brass band and they walk past, and it gradually fades when the next one's coming up, probably playing something completely different. So it must have been tremendous sort of Charles Ivesian experience. And these brass bands were also paid different amounts depending on how good they were, which was interesting, I thought. And some of them got new uniforms, especially for the event. So what were the brass bands doing for people, for the miners? Well, first of all, interestingly, I think there were obviously a sonic identity thing, but an important thing was that you could hear the brass bands before you could see anything. So they would signal that something was happening, and that you'd know that the next band and group of men was coming. And that was used a lot across the landscape generally, that brass bands played at different events. It must have been a way of signaling where that was going on. Then they were very, they have their military origins, and so they were smart and respectable. They were well rehearsed and hopefully, and yeah, so respectable and giving a strong identity of purpose and accomplishment to the miners. Then they were also playing music that was important to the miners, that was familiar. So they were sort of supporting them through that familiar music. And also they were enhancing the emotions of the day, obviously. Then importantly, theirs was the only music heard that day. So there was no master's music. So it was all mining music. So they were dominating the landscape, the sonic landscape with their music, putting their mark on it, if you like. And then afterwards, when it was time to have some refreshments, it was more about entertaining and performing, playing dance music, which was a main role of brass bands at this time. In that photograph there, you can see that image of the Asylum. That was actually called the Asylum for Idiots and Imbeciles. When I first came across that title, I thought how awful it was, but in fact, the title was given to it to reassure locals that they were harmless. And those gardens, it used moral therapy. Music was a form of moral therapy, but also gardening was. And so locals would go there to the gardens. They would also listen to the brass band playing there and mix with the inmates. So it was actually quite good compared to later asylums. This is just an image from the day of where they would have walked. As you can see, it's not very developed that's the main street of Newcastle. Okay, so just to wrapping that up, so how we saw the brass band working, it was bringing music from home, making the environment more familiar, it was connecting with the identity of miners. It was energizing them as they marched and regulating, keeping them in time so they didn't collide with each other, and also extending ability to keep going if you got tired. And then it was commanding the space and connecting the demonstrators through sound and creating a space for relaxing afterwards. And importantly, it was giving the brass bands respect and respectability. I didn't mention that Mark Dent was another important find was Mark Dent, who was one of the 12 that petitioned Parliament on behalf of miners in the 1844 Great Strike, was banned in the UK and came out to Newcastle. And in his speech, he talks about respect. This is where I really got this idea from, how miners don't respect themselves. So how can they expect respect from outside? And then the identities of being working class, minor, masculine identities, which they were promoting. And so I just thought I'd finish off with thinking about how does this work help us understand migrant communities today. And I've been to a few migrant community workshops and performances. So I think what we can learn from that is music is really important in linking to lost places, because just as most of those miners would never go back to Britain, a lot of refugees and migrants are never going to go back. So the music is incredibly important for that. Then it connects them to each other and to other communities. It's a sign of culture and accomplishment. And probably the main thing I got from it is that music as a means of communication doesn't need words. We all know that. But if people are performing and in a committed way, authentic way, their music to other people who are perhaps either the majority group in the country they've come to, or other migrant groups, there is a way of communicating directly through music that grabs people's attention and that's not word-based, and that can build empathy and respect. So I think that's probably one of the biggest things I got out of that. So thank you very much for listening. As I mentioned, my main reference sources of reference were newspapers as well as some accounts from the day, and I just got some of my sources, not all. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen. I'm a little bit slow because I'm wanting to put a paper in the chat, and I'm going to do that now. I've just found it. Hang on, I want it to go to everyone. And then Helen, you'll see this as well. Because as you were talking about the role of music in, well, I'm looking at a paper called The Role of Music in the Integration of Cultural Minorities. It's actually a chapter by Richard Parncutt, which you may have come across, but this was research that, I mean, he reported it's in the Festschrift book for John Sloboda, so 2011, but I remember the project. It was a festival of migrant of music in Graz, where there is a lot of tension between different communities, and this was a way to bring different communities together. So I've just put it in, but I've not actually.
Oh, thank you.
Here we go.
I mean, I do know Richard, but I didn't know actually that I didn't know that chapter, so I'm now going to go to it. Thank you.
There you are, you've got it. Thank you so much. A really, really, really interesting talk. And I've got a question that I can ask you while other people are thinking up their questions. But I'm going to put, oh, where's he gone? John will ask you a question about Welsh music making, I am sure. You now have all your 19th century Manchester people here. I think Rachel's gone. She sent me a message saying, could I please demonstrate my strong Scottish accents, which I can do in Glaswegian and in Edinburgh if required to do so. But I'll ask my question quickly, which is, when did instruments start being shipped out for the bands? And also, I mean, just looking at your picture of the Welsh harp, I presume those came out on ships in the first place, but when did they then start being built in Australia?
Oh, that's a tricky question. They certainly were being sold in Sydney and Newcastle in the 1870s, probably from the late 1860s. Actually, not. It's actually something that I didn't go into that much for earlier. So it was very much about what resources people had, particularly sheet music. So a lot of the music was what they had in their head. And as you would know, bandmasters arranged songs and anything for bands. I didn't mention the local composers, though they might have played a couple of works. The bandmaster Gates had his Pride of the North Waltzes that he'd written that could have been performed at that 1874 demonstration. And there was another composer teacher who composed on the side, really, Randolph, who wrote the Cricketers' Quadrilles, for example, that was arranged for brass band. So I know I know that the brass bands, when they were forming, often went off to Sydney to get instruments. But I couldn't tell you the year, but I can tell you one little interesting fact, which is that the piano came out with the first fleet. That's been talked about a lot in Australia, and only yesterday I heard a piece composed for a replica of the piano that came out of the first fleet by an Indigenous composer who then kind of coded it in a binary way. So it was quite a strange piece, but it was a great way to sort of decolonize the first piano, I guess.
Am I right in thinking that it's been restored and it's in Sydney?
Yeah,
I've got a feeling it's at the Conservatorium, and they're very proud of it.
Oh yes, probably have to check that. Yeah.
I'm going to, what I should say to people who may be watching this on YouTube, if I think you can send any questions you may have to Tom, who will pass them on. I think that's right. But otherwise, if people have got questions that they want to ask, please put them in the chat. In the meantime, who would like to be the first other person than me to ask Helen a question?
So I
Yes.
saw that Tom had his hand raised before, and now Alex does.
Right. Well, I can't see Tom's hand, but I can see Jeff's. And Jeff has a honoured history of being the first person to ask a question. So I think we should keep the tradition up.
Oh,
Jeff,
okay.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Helen, for an absolutely fascinating talk.
Oh, thanks.
I thoroughly enjoyed that. Jane, in a way, has stolen my question, because I was interested in how instruments were sourced. But a kind of parallel question to that is, what do we know about the way musicians were being trained? Obviously, people who performed in bands, people who sang in choirs, there must have been some sort of pedagogic tradition that supported that.
Yeah, so I do know about that. I think the reason why there are gaps in my knowledge is because it's mostly from what people chose to write about in newspapers or didn't choose. So when we think about miners, they're hardworking people, they don't keep diaries, they didn't really write letters. So there's not very much to find there. But the first newspaper, and of course, I talk about settlers, but it's quite a bit later than other parts, because although Newcastle was an early penal colony, it was a penal colony, not a settler colony. So from the 1840s, there was a newspaper called the Maitland Mercury that reported on the whole region. And so it typically was a migrant musician who got music going. So in the case of the first people to come out was a guy called Edward Fanning, who actually came out with his father, Charles Fanning. They were both musicians. I think they came from the Isle of, from Jersey originally, possibly from Scotland before that. Not quite sure if I got that right. And Fanning was of unusual character, very enthusiastic, multi-instrumentalist, and also very keen on fun and games, but got heavily into blackface as well. And so the first band formed was a temperance band. So temperance was a big thing. And again, there's that view, you know, that temperance is something to control the masses. Well, the temperance thing came from the working class people because they wanted their societies to be functioning and not drink driven. So the Temperance Band was formed in the 1840s, led by Fanning. So of course he taught everybody in that band, and he did play trombone, cello, violin, not sure what else, and was obviously a good teacher because he got together a band of about 15. So, and they played at everything because there wasn't another one for quite some time. And then so when the actual bands that were associated with townships didn't start till the mid 1860s. There was a sort of general miners band in Newcastle in 1860. And once a key element in this training was when the railway connection was made between Maitland and Newcastle, because then Edward Fanning, who was also a compositor on the Maitland Mercury, was able to travel easily from Maitland to, which is about 35 kilometers, I think, from Newcastle, to Newcastle, and start being able to work there as well. So he then trained bands in Newcastle, and once again got them to do blackface. Be a band concert where they quickly changed in the interval and then presented an Ethiopian entertainment. Then later there were more, I mean, there were quite a lot of military in Sydney, obviously, so there were people who were trained in music, and there were also people who weren't trained in music who were being musicians because it was a much better position to have than a fighting one. So the military training, the military tradition of playing was kind of propping up the acquiring of skills, I'd say. So you won't be surprised to know that most of the instrumental playing was associated with wind and brass bands, and not really so much with string playing. That was always a much smaller proportion of music being performed. So I don't know, I probably could say more, but is that starting to answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. And it's probably also a gendered thing as well, because string playing is associated more with women as performers, and therefore it's often.
Well, in this period, any public groups were all male, so including string groups, but women were really important as accompanists, and they were obviously very accomplished, because they would be accompanying whole Eisteddfods or very big concerts. And in fact, that was a very important means of survival for women, that they were able to teach music. And there are quite a lot of advertisements for women from the 1870s at least as music teachers. So the migrants played a huge part in what kind of music started up. So there was this very important migrant called Franz Becker, who arrived in Newcastle in 1869 and left in 1879. Not quite sure why he left. It was all a bit sudden. And he had lots of aspirations for forming an orchestra and so on, but didn't quite manage to do that. But he did put on a lot of concerts. He was obviously a good pianist, and he put on multiple piano concerts, 8 pianos, and he also worked with bands, so and composed music. So he did have a big effect, I think, on the quality of music teaching, and taught a lot of those. Either if he didn't teach the women, he taught someone who then taught the women. But obviously, a lot of people came out with music skills. It didn't come from nowhere as well.
It's obviously a very rich tradition. Thank you.
I'm going to hand over to Jack. He's the next. Oh, I beg your pardon. It's Alex next, and then Jack.
Hi, Alex. How are you?
Hi, Helen. That was really interesting. Thank you. And it must be really late for you there as well. So thank you for that. I had a similar question, I think, to Jane's. But what I found quite interesting was that around that period, certainly in Britain with brass bands, it's only sort of a recent thing where all the instrumentation has become sort of uniformed. And it struck me that the picture that sort of came up, they had things like tenor horns and stuff, or certainly looked like it, that had only been invented sort of a decade or a couple of decades earlier. And that was sort of quite cutting edge. So I wonder whether there were also sort of brass bands at that part of the world at that point in history where they did have sort of a bit of a hodgepodge of different instruments. And then the other question was as well, it was, with the kind of brass band side of things and the music they had access to, obviously a lot of music was arranged for brass bands, all popular songs and opera arias and all that kind of stuff. I just wonder whether you knew, I mean, it might be impossible to know, but how long would it take, for example, I don't know, an opera aria from something new to come out of Central Europe or somewhere, in Britain, and then make its way down, without the internet and stuff, to be arranged by someone in Australia.
Okay, so where shall I start with your questions? Yeah, well spotted about the brass band, because a lot of people said to me when I was doing the research, oh, they won't be real brass bands, they won't be that. And I've said, well, it looks like they are. I think, as you would know, the great advantage of those the Distin type brass bands is that they're going to be in tune. Beginners can make quite a reasonable sound, and they can jump between different instruments. So maybe there was someone who had that vision. Yes, there were other instruments as well, like even serpents, but I think it probably was mixed in places, but as you said, as you spotted, that was a proper brass band in the sense of what we call proper. Of course, we in Australia, I can say we now because I became a citizen, we didn't have brass band contests in the same way as you until quite a bit later, so they didn't really get going started a little bit in the 1880s and then got big from the 1890s, nationals, Eisteddfods and so on. So talking about the other question you asked, which was, just remind me, how long did it take? Oh, for music to come across.
Yeah, to kind of filter down.
Yeah. So I think that varied, because I read one of my sources was this crazy guy who came to Newcastle, who was a French prisoner of war in 1873, and he writes about how he heard the music that was popular in France at the time being played on barrel organs and coming out of people's windows. So perhaps it was a little bit quicker than you might think. Certainly, so the operas, Lucretia would be one that was, the bands would have performed. It's from, off the top of my head, of course, the, well, actually, the blackface minstrels popularized a lot of opera. So opera in the colonies in the 1850s was pretty much a hodgepodge, because they didn't have the singers. You'd get women singing bass roles, and they probably performed a lot of it in English, and it might have been a shortened version. But there was the minstrel, the blackface minstrel groups that came out from the US in the 1850s were performing. Some of them were performing those opera burlesques. So that would have popularized a lot of opera. And so the two, that would have been, I'm going to have a bit of a brain seize now, so I'll put it in the chat, what the main two ones that were performed. But Donizetti was important, of course, and Bellini. Yeah. Sorry about the brain freeze.
No, thank you. That's great.
I'm wondering if there's anybody else who has a question. Jack's asked his question, Alex has asked his, Jeff has asked his. Jack, do you have another question you want to ask, or you're just waving at me?
Just my first question, actually.
Yes, I didn't say.
Didn't quite ask mine yet. But my question's actually already mostly been covered. Thank you for the amazing talk so far. Like, I was interested in how this worked into the sort of competitive nature that brass bands very quickly took in the UK. And you said that was a bit later that reached Australia, because that was already by the 1860s quite a big thing in England. And also you mentioned the Distin family and how they popularized these sax horns in both Britain and America. And I've read stories of them even making it to Canada. So I was intrigued if there's any similar sort of traveling entrepreneurs who made it as far as Australia in that regard. And my only other question is actually regarding what Alex just asked about arrangements of this. It just came up in my research quite interestingly, how contemporaneous composers quite often like the idea of getting their music arranged for these bands. And I found some really interesting communication between Richard Wagner and Wilhelm Wieprecht, who was the director of the Prussian military bands up until the 1870s, co-inventor of the tuba, amongst other things. And how Wagner complimenting him on the great work that he'd done arranging some of his most recent works for band. And with the Bavarian military as well, there's some really interesting communication. So these connections grew quicker than you might imagine.
Oh, thanks. That's fantastic. I looked into that a lot. I can tell. So the Distin family, I don't think they came to Australia. But bell ringing families came. Wow. That was a big thing.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think the minstrels were probably the purveyors of quite a lot of culture, even though it was and of course their respectability. They had to have the respectability hat on, which they did by performing this kind of music as well. And actually, because I've done a lot of work on blackface as well, but that wasn't in my thesis, but it's in the book. But they were often very talented musicians who could make more money being a blackface than they could in other ways. So yeah. I don't know that I've really added much to what you already know. As I mentioned,
so that's already really useful. Thank you.
Yeah, so the local composers obviously love to have their music arranged for bands as well.
The bell ringers are still coming. When I think about visiting Perth and hearing the bells that were at St Martin in the Fields, and that came to Australia, and they became the what were they? They were the Millennium bells. I'm suddenly remembering the Federation bells. Those are in Melbourne, aren't they? But that's completely different. John Habron has a question.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you very much, Helen, for a really fascinating presentation. And thank you again for doing it at such an ungodly hour for yourself. You must be really, really, really tired. Contrary to
the day, so people must have taught each other or used some possibly had access to some of those little dancing guidebooks. Have you seen those? Of the 19th century, those little how to dance to something. They may have had access to that, or they just taught each other. Perhaps they made it up as well as they went along, but absolutely loved dancing. And that's where also you can argue that music really extended people's capabilities, because in the reports, the dancing would go on all night. So Friday night would be a popular night, or Saturday night, because depending on if they had to work the next day, and it wouldn't break up till dawn. So the stamina. So again, you know, the music keeping you going. And of course, I mean, that's proven now through research with sports, and how people can, particularly have a look at cyclists, they use music to extend their capabilities. So going back to the other question, which was, sorry, you have to remind me. Oh, the asylums, yes. So that's fascinating. So the reports on the asylum, musics in the asylum, there were two types. There was music inside the asylum, which was mainly in this period, which is a smaller period. I'm talking up until 1880, which was actually mainly a minstrel group. So the superintendent of the asylum was very keen on music, and his children formed a minstrel group with people who were amateur minstrels in the area. And so it was probably not minstrel group in the way we understand it, but just a sort of a structure to play anything that you could, that you knew, so duets or songs. And they were public, so people would come in, but they'd mingle with the inmates of the asylum and listen to the music. So we don't have records from inmates that I know of, but we do have reporting that how the inmates were enjoying it, and what a great job Frederick Kane was doing. And then they, because the asylum was built on what had been a recreation ground, and people were used to coming there, they continued to do that. And by the 1870s, there was a regular brass band concert on a Saturday afternoon. And again, that was for the public and inmates. So that's about all I know. There is a thesis by Anne Hardy on the asylum at Newcastle. And I think she also wrote a chapter or article in the same publication. I had one which was about the sounds of the asylum, because before it became an asylum, it was a home for delinquent girls or something, an industrial school they called it, and it was a pretty horrifying place then. The usual thing of people, this is where the respectable, unrespectable comes in. So people who were undesirable in Sydney were moved up to Newcastle and put into this place, either as an institute for children they couldn't do anything with, or then becoming an asylum. So they weren't local people being put in the asylum, they were being shipped, you know. So it's the out of sight, out of mind mentality. Yeah, so, but moral therapy was a thing, you probably know that. And it does seem like quite a humane type of asylum at that time. Later on, of course, there was all those terrible stories in the 20th century about places where people were shut away and never saw the light of day.
So I'm going to hand over to Anna and then Barbara. And if anybody else wants to ask a question, they need to do it before Helen has finished answering Barbara's question, because I think we've had the equivalent of half another seminar, which is just brilliant. It's lovely, but I'm also aware of what time in the morning it is for Helen, and I trust you're planning to go back to bed and catch up on a bit more sleep before tomorrow.
I'm going to try. I don't know if I'll be able to. Yeah, sure. So
let's go over to Anna.
Thanks, Helen. That was really interesting. I was just interested in a bit more about the bands, because you've said that the miners came from sort of South Wales and then the North East and some from Scotland. So I wondered how much the band stayed within those sort of groups. So, you know, was it a case of, you know, all the ones from South Wales played in one band and all the ones from Durham played in another, or did they begin to sort of intermingle?
Yeah, well, this is a really great thing about this period, because it was a period in which they were forming community. They went out of their way to help other groups in a way that later didn't happen. So, for example, Presbyterian choirs would give concerts to support a Roman Catholic church purchase of an organ, something like that, which, if you know anything about the Orange movement, was not something later. I mean, it was, if you're a Protestant, you do never not mix with a Catholic, and you don't marry into a Catholic family. So they were pretty much thrown together. So that's the thing about the communities. They might have had some immediate family, and they probably did send home to get more family, but they had to work together. So there was no, Wallsend and Lambton both had a large Welsh community, and they had Welsh congregational churches and Baptist churches and Presbyterian churches, and definitely the choirs would have come from, for example, Wallsend Presbyterian Church had a choir early on. But then there was also this large group of Geordies who mainly practiced primitive Methodism, and they had a huge impact, because primitive Methodism was all about democratic ideas, education for everybody, making the most of your abilities, and of course also it was about outdoor music. So they had their first service outdoors, and they sang in the streets and gathered followers that way, but they had their Sunday schools or Sabbath schools. So I don't come across any animosity between those groups, and they always work together. So even that I didn't mention it, but that special concert for Caradog, that was given by Welsh and Geordie musicians and organisers. So yeah, and at this time also the mine managers were really involved as well, and very supportive, because a lot of them had been miners themselves. And so it was later on that the class system began to sort of be seen, and they kept themselves to themselves more. Yeah. Thanks, so that's what excited me. That really got me going. Why can't we always be like this? But no.
That's great. Thank you.
And Barbara.
You'd be pleased to hear that Anna asked a lot of the question I was going to ask. I'm fascinated by the cultural and religious makeup that you've talked about, the various communities, and it's interesting to hear the level of cooperation, which of course wouldn't have been replicated back in this part of the world. I just caught something. You were talking about the women as accompanists, but you had already talked about the German pianists. So where did the German pianists who performed at the Eisteddfod, where do they fit into all of that?
There was only one German.
Right.
Well, actually, there was also a band leader called Moilman, who committed suicide. I think it was a really hard life for migrant musicians. So there was only Franz Becker, and it's quite common in Australia colonies for German musicians to be the leaders musically, who happen to have come out for one reason or another. So Franz Becker was born in 1840, and he came in 1869. He, I think, had been in Victoria before. And I should actually mention, because of women, I didn't talk too much about women, but the Primitive Methodist Church, of course, was the only one that had female preachers, and was pretty, was supporting equality up to a point anyway, whatever point was achievable. So there was that background to that. And although the Eisteddfods were all organised, the committees were typically all male, the women had a lot of important roles in running and performing at Eisteddfods. And they also had their own sort of benevolent societies raising money, but they also put on concerts. So there was a couple of women who put on concerts as well. So there was the possibility of pushing against the tide, as it were. Yeah.
So I'm not going to ask you about, because I always think about the string players, the violinists in particular. I mean, we had a lot of migrant Jewish violinists, but nobody should think that There weren't, Jews didn't come on as part of the penal colony, because they did. I mean, the first Jewish communities in Australia did come as convicts. And so, I mean, I just think that whole question of who plays what, who brings what music is really interesting. But it's been an absolutely fantastic talk, Helen.
Thanks.
Really interesting. It was, your research interests chime very much with our interests here. And I hope that there will be a time for you to come in real life. Yes. when you come. Do you still have family in Britain, Helen? Do you?
Oh yes, they're all in lockdown.
Okay,
Yes.
so when it's all over and there is no more quarantining in hotels, when you come, let us know when you're going to be here, and I think we'd all love to hear where you get to with the projects that you're starting out now. So,
thank you, and I'll love to hear what you're all doing as well.
Well, that's the great thing. If you come and talk to the PhD students, then next time come and do a doctoral training seminar, and then you will hear about them. But have a look on the website, because you'll see what everybody's doing, and particularly you want to follow the work of, forgive me, but Anna, and have a look at Jeff's work. That's all. That's done and dusted now, and Rachel Johnson's. And as for women brass players, you want to be looking at Eleanor Gweno's work. I'm sure there are other people doing other work that's also relevant, but those are the ones I would jump out at for now. Have I missed anybody obvious out? I do hope not. It's not, I wasn't intending to make invidious comparisons. All of our PhD students are doing really, really interesting work. So thank you all very much indeed for coming. It's lovely to have you, lovely to have your questions, folks. And next week, I happen to know that Caroline Kerwin is giving a talk on her research on synesthesia. And I know that that is something that is of a lot of interest to a lot of musicians. I edited a journal article that is to be published in Musica Scientiae, so that's how I know her work. She hasn't actually finished her PhD yet, but she's a mature student, and it's all good work. Tom, did you want to say something?
Just that talk will be on the 3rd of Feb, so it'll be 2 weeks. Sorry, 3rd of March.
3rd of March.
Yeah.
Right, so we don't have a research seminar next week.
No.
Right, very good. There's probably a very good reason for that. Great, I think in fact I know exactly what it is, come to think of it. Lovely. Well, I'm going to turn my